that is commonly referred to as the drug czar's office in the administration. In the last 30 plus years, I have worked for the Drug Enforcement Administration, and I also, during that time frame, was a police officer in Washington, D.C. I was asked by John Fullwider to come here today and talk to you about methamphetamine, its abuse, its manufacturing, and all of the collateral issues or problems as associated with methamphetamine. I am willing at any time during this to answer any question about any drug or any issue that relates to drug abuse and or the sale, manufacture. It does not have to be specifically associated with methamphetamine. Unfortunately, I have some personal knowledge of the manufacturing process, which I'll go through for about the next 45 minutes and take you through the history of methamphetamine, where it started, where we are today, and the issues that surround that. Originally, methamphetamine was manufactured using a chemical that is entirely too long for me to pronounce, but its short version is P2P. Referred to on the street as P-dope, it was manufactured from the 60s up into the 70s and 80s, and it was controlled by outlaw motorcycle gangs in the United States. The nickname or slang name that you have heard as crank came from that era when methamphetamine was manufactured. It was placed in the crankcase of motorcycles, and the motorcycles were trailered from point A to point B in order to deliver the product. That's where the original nickname came from. P2P dope, or P-dope, is a manufacturing process that takes about 18 hours from start to finish. It takes a significant amount of knowledge in the field of chemistry. It's a complicated process. It is what we all remember from our chemistry class of heating mantles, triple neck flasks, all of the laboratory glassware that process did use. And as I said, it took a person of significant knowledge to do manufacture under that old process. In 1980s, for that entire decade, I was assigned with DEA in Washington, D.C. And I lived through, when I say lived through, I worked through what has been commonly referred to as the crack epidemic. Crack cocaine versus powder cocaine is a smokable form of the drug. It provides an intense high almost immediately, but it lasts very short in duration. Minutes versus hours. During that time frame, I thought crack, as a lot of people did, to include the legislature, was a damning drug, and some enhancements on the penalties were provided by Congress, and significant enforcement was assigned to address that problem. Crack cocaine, as I said, is a derivative or a change in the complexure of cocaine, which comes from the cocoa plant and is grown in South America, as everyone knows. I transferred to Southwest Missouri in 1990, and during the first year or so while in Springfield, we still experienced one or two, and that's it, P-dope labs. That is the manufacturing process that was complicated. It usually was manufactured at a remote location. It required copious amounts of water and electricity, and the chemicals were purchased in 55-gallon drums through road chemical companies, and the manufacturing process took place. In 1992, a man by the name of, or nickname Red, came into the DEA office and said that he wanted to tell me where there was a meth lab. I asked him, what did you see? Now, keeping in mind what I had just said about methamphetamine and labs up to that point. He said he was in a home down in Reed Springs, Missouri, and in the garage, he saw a can of Coleman camping fuel. I said, okay. I said, I have that in my garage. He said, yep, but he said they used that to make methamphetamine. And I said, well, what else did you see? And he said, well, I saw a can of starting fluid in that garage as well. I said, I got an old lawnmower that is very difficult to start, and I have a can of that as well. And he probably saw the skepticism on my face. And he said, let me stop you and tell you this. It's the best blanking dope I've ever used. They forced me at gunpoint to use it. What I didn't know at that moment is that Red was due to provide a urine sample the following day because he was on federal parole. And his motivation to come in and tell me this was so that when he reported the following day, he could say that I was forced at gunpoint to use methamphetamine. But he said it to emphasize the point because I kept pushing and I said, well, what else did you see? He said, there's a big black trash bag in the garage and it's got, if not 500, 1,000 empty boxes of Sudafed cold medicine. They're in that trash bag and they're sitting up in the corner of the garage. I said, what else? He said, I saw a jar of heat, antifreeze for gas tanks. He said, I saw a can of acetone. And you can see exactly where I'm going here is that a lot of us in the room and those of you in the remote site have a lot of this stuff around your house. Because then we move in and I ask him, what else did you see? And he said, well, I saw a can of drain opener, Drano. I said, well, I have that underneath my sink. I said, is there anything in particular that you saw that were not these things that are in everybody's house? He said, well, there was a mason jar filled with a liquid, and they told me it was lamp oil. And inside of that liquid was what looked like a hockey puck, a round, dark gray or black object, and it was floating at the bottom of that lamp oil. I said, what is that? He said, well, I don't know, but they use that in the manufacturing process. So, knowing the history of methamphetamine, being exposed to the previous types of labs, I was completely unsure and had serious doubts that there was methamphetamine at all on that property. As we all know that in order for law enforcement to go into a house, you have to have probable cause. Probable cause is that threshold that the courts assign to say that what would lead a reasonable and prudent person to believe that a crime is occurring or is about to occur at that property in order to get into someone's home to do a search. I called a chemist, friend of mine in Chicago, a guy by the name of Sandy Angelos. I said, Sandy, this guy is sitting here telling me that they're manufacturing dope, and this is what he says to me. He said, there's heat there, there's ether there, there's Coleman fuel there. I go through the entire thing, tell him that there's a whole bunch of Sudafed tablets, and there's also what appears to be a hockey puck in lamp oil. He said, I've never heard of such a thing. And he said, but let me do a little research and I'll call you back. He calls back and he said, John, there's a basis in literature for such a formula, but it's never been seen in the United States. That is a verbatim quote. The reason I know the verbatim quote now some 15, 16 years later is because I used that quote in the affidavit when I applied for the search, because I was so unsure, did not know that methamphetamine could be manufactured with such a process. And we went into the home and we found exactly where he said everything was in the home. And the other thing that he added is the dope is sitting in the oven on a cookie sheet, and it looks like a cakey white substance sitting on the cookie sheet. He said, that's the dope. We went down, collected everything, did a field test on the powder in the oven. It tested positive for methamphetamine. And then my inclination was, well, it may be dope, but it's not the best blankety dope in the world. I'm thinking if you take these chemicals that are in a lot of people's homes, mix them all together to come up with methamphetamine, you came up with some average, if you did get methamphetamine out of it, I think it would have been a surprise, but the field test positive for meth, so I sent it to the lab, and to my surprise, it came back 94% methamphetamine. I asked the guy that we arrested, Danny, Pete, I said, how much did it cost you to manufacture 1 ounce of meth by going to the store? He said, $100 worth of chemicals, I can manufacture 1 ounce of methamphetamine. At the time, methamphetamine was selling for $2,000 an ounce on the street. That's $1,900 profit. Having the ability to make your way to the store, either a hardware store or a retail merchant, mixing chemicals in the house and manufacturing methamphetamine. What was described as the hockey puck sitting in lamp oil was actually sodium metal. Sodium metal was used in sodium halide lights, or commonly referred to as big city lights. It was used in leaded gasoline. And we found a receipt from a chemical company out in the east in South Carolina where the sodium metal came from. So we said, well, this is the only thing that we have here that we can actually target, go after, find out where they're getting it without setting up in every hardware, every retail merchant, and trying to watch people buying camping fuel and starting fluid that probably have very legitimate reasons for buying it. We found out that the person by the name of Bob Palais is the one that claims to have, and I have every reason to believe that he did, went to Southwest Missouri State University Library in a manual and found the formula for manufacturing methamphetamine. Now, what he claimed was on the top of the page where he found the formula was a Nazi swastika. That has never been proven. It is in literature. As Sandy Angelo said, it has been manufactured before. It was manufactured in Germany, but we could never find anything to verify that part of the story. Bob Palais was a high school graduate, had no background in chemistry. He was an inquisitive person, still is to this day. I talked to him probably about a month ago. Bob Palais, the guy that claims to have discovered it, now regrets his move some 15, 18 years later. He has suffered from he suffers from Parkinson's disease, which his doctor says is most likely caused by the use of methamphetamine. And he told me that he had taught 5 people how to cook. He was somewhat of a, the word nerd is not the right word to use, but he had 5 fish and tackle boxes when we arrested him. Each one of them was numbered, and it had pH paper in it, It had some instructions, and he actually fashioned himself as somewhat of an instructor or professor to teach other people how to cook. He told us who he taught to cook, and we went after each one of them in short order. We were done with the fifth one in about 2 weeks, and his name was Mike Poplawski. Mike Poplawski, when I asked him the question, as I asked everybody else, recognizing that sodium metal was the only thing that we had really to go after that was not controlled, that was not readily available, and somebody had to reach out to a concern to buy it, I asked Mike, I said, where'd you get your sodium metal? He said, I didn't get it. He said, I made it. I said, how did you make it? He said, I took a cast iron skillet and put it on the electric stove. And he said, I took some Red Devil lye and put it in the cast iron skillet and turned it on. He said, I heated it to a liquid. He said, I took a pair of jumper cables and hooked them to a battery, which I brought into the kitchen. On the positive coil, or the positive cable from the jumper cables, I put a piece of copper tubing. On the negative, I hooked to the electric stove coil and back to the battery. And then I would drag this piece of copper tubing across the top of the liquid Red Devil lye, and it would look like a tadpole in a pond shooting across the liquid. And he said, I'd scoop it out, put it on a napkin, and there's your sodium metal. Again, as I've often said, I was the smartest kid in the dumb row. I didn't believe that story either. Called Sandy Angelos back again. He's a chemist at the DA lab, and I said, Sandy, what do you think of this? He said, goodness gracious. He said, I'd never heard of it, but he said, let me look into it and I'll call you back. He called back and he said, John, it's possible, but the gases that are created when you heat the Red Devil lye in the cast iron skillet is hydrogen gas. Do you remember the Hindenburg? I said, I certainly do. Mike Poplawski, within 2 weeks, blew up his home with his kids sitting in the living room, doing this exact same thing. Created the hydrogen gas, had a gas hot water heater in a closet in the kitchen, which ignited the fumes and blew up the home. What we have in this manufacturing process is a whole cast of problems for both the user, the families, the environment, and anybody that's around the manufacturing process. 80% of the methamphetamine consumed or purchased in the Midwest comes across from Mexico and or is manufactured on the southwest border. Most of that methamphetamine is what is referred to as red P dope. It's made from red phosphorus. And this, of course, by that swastika is referred to as Nazi dope. Nazi dope is the predominant manufacturing process in this state. It is as well in the state of Iowa. When you get to Missouri, which had probably about 2,000 clandestine labs last year, they're split between Nazi dope and red P dope. Nazi dope uses, as you've heard either on the news or in articles that you've read, uses anhydrous ammonia as one of the chemicals. And most of that anhydrous ammonia today is stolen from farmers or nurse tanks or wherever in rural areas. With the red P, or the red phosphorus method, the red phosphorus is a chemical that can be purchased, and or in some cases what is seen is the striker plates from matches. There may be 5,000, 10,000 matchbooks in a home where you serve a search warrant to recover a lab, and they just scrape off the red phosphorus that's on the striker plate to use that. That too has a definite gas called phosphine gas that is deadly if inhaled. It is odorless, it is colorless, and it is a byproduct of the manufacturing process, just to illustrate the dangerousness of both processes in illicit labs. Pseudoephedrine, or Sudafed, which is a company name, but pseudoephedrine or ephedrine is the main precursor chemical for manufacturing methamphetamine. It converts on a 1-to-1 ratio to methamphetamine if done properly. What the cooks versus the chemists, and they're referred to as cooks because they follow a recipe versus a formula. Recipes are on the internet. Most of the recipes are passed from cook to cook, and that's how they make their way around the methamphetamine producing population, if you would call them that. A cook will follow the recipe to the letter. If it calls for, as one recipe did in a case that I worked on, JD80, which was John Deere 80% ether to start tractors. If it called for JD80, they would drive past 10, maybe 15 auto parts stores, passing up the ether just to get exactly what it called for on the recipe. Anhydrous ammonia in 1992, when we first discovered it, was being purchased in 150-pound cylinders from a gas supply store. When we went to the gas supply store and asked them if they had any unusual purchases of anhydrous ammonia, they said they didn't think they had any unusual purchases, but they thought they were losing some of those 150-pound cylinders. They had no fence, no entrance and exit, secured. They sat out on the dock, and people were just going and picking up the 150-pound cylinders and driving them away. Sodium metal became, at least in their minds, when it first started, something based on what we were doing, that is asking the question, where did you get your sodium metal, was something that they had to get away from. There was a guy by the name of Randy Schultz who claims on his birthday he discovered that lithium metal, the insides of a lithium battery, were of similar compound in nature and would manufacture methamphetamine. So from about 1993 on, lithium metal is the predominant metal used in the manufacturing process. They're all gained from the inside of the lithium battery. They cut it open with a hacksaw blade, open it up, and peel it. Sodium and or lithium metal is highly reactive to water. If you unwrap, peel a battery, with the moisture in the air, it will start to smoke. With any liquid, it will explode. So when they take it out, they immediately put it in some kind of lamp oil, kerosene, or something to keep the moisture away from the lithium metal. Otherwise, it will explode. We started following the anhydrous ammonia tanks. After they put up a fence, this company agreed to cooperate with law enforcement and notify us if anybody came by to pick it up. Anhydrous ammonia, as you know, most of you know, has an agricultural use here in this state, but it also is used in commercial refrigeration. Ice cream factories use it in the place of Freon as a coolant in the large refrigeration units. So the crooks, or the cooks, would learn that, and then, of course, when they came to purchase it, one guy, and I'll never forget this one, said, go up to the gas supply store, and he said, I wanted to buy a cylinder of anhydrous ammonia, and it was about $175 for the container. And the guy said, well, what are you using it for? And he said, well, I'm going to charge the air conditioner in my car. Well, the two didn't mix. He knew it had something to do with refrigerant, but he thought maybe that was the right thing to say. They would then notify law enforcement and not deliver it, and then tell them it'd be there in an hour or so, and we'd go over and sit on the place and follow them around. One particular individual that told that story showed up on a given afternoon, and we followed him in hopes of getting to the lab site, that is, where they were manufacturing meth. He stopped about 8 or 10 times. One of the last stops that he made was in a strip mall that had a daycare center on the end of it. He's got a 150-pound cylinder of compressed gas sitting in the back of his van. We decided to approach him and talk to him, and we had a chat with him saying that, asked him the question. He told us that he was going to charge his air conditioner in his car. We told him that that's not a proper use for anhydrous ammonia, and asked him if he was willing to surrender that cylinder. He said, no, hell no, I bought it and I'm keeping it. Well, by the standards by which we work, he bought it, it's a legal product, and he left with it. Although we did meet him about 2 weeks later. I got a call from the emergency room in Joplin, Missouri, that a doctor from the emergency room was saying that he had a patient there that was suffering from burns that he received in an explosion, and he was told by the local police that it may have been a methamphetamine lab. So he asked, what are the chemicals used? Because we want to note that in the treatment. We also want to know it for our own safety and well-being. I went through the process in a very short rendition, and when I got to the sodium metal, I told him it's highly reactive to water, and he said, well, that explains one thing, is why we weren't able to keep him on the table when we were washing the wounds with saline solution. Because the sodium metal was embedded into the skin, and as they were washing them, that sodium metal was exploding underneath the skin. What this gentleman decided to do is, in the process, they'll take a normal blender, take all the Sudafed tablets, grind them up, put a denatured alcohol of some sort on it to draw out the pseudoephedrine. But he thought, I can get this done in half the time. Now, the time start to finish is less than an hour. But he thought, well, I'm here in this motel room. I could probably get this made up and maybe sell some a little bit quicker. So I'm going to do it all in the blender. So he goes through about the first 4 steps until it comes time to add the ether. He adds the ether into the blender, pushes the blender speed motor, which sends off an electrical spark. It blows up, blows him out of the hotel window and into the parking lot. He survived, lost an eye, lost probably some other valuable parts that we were given, but he survived that explosion. And there is no truth to the thing that somebody may have mentioned, I guess this wasn't used to charge the refrigerant in your car. Nobody ever said that to him after the fact. What I would like to do is, if anybody has any questions along the lines as we go through this, feel free to stop me, because I'm not sure that I can continue just talking about methamphetamine and the process. To give you a little bit of background on Sudafed, there is one oxygen on pseudoephedrine. That is the normal decongestant that you take for cold, hay fever, or whatever the case is. This process of mixing various chemicals with pseudoephedrine removes that oxygen. That is the only difference between the two drugs, is one oxygen molecule that has to be removed. The recent move on the part of the state legislature in this state to place pseudoephedrine behind the counter, behind the pharmacy counter, and requires people to ask for it, I think is a small inconvenience to ask the legitimate customer to endure, because without Sudafed, methamphetamine cannot be manufactured. without ephedrine, methamphetamine cannot be manufactured. In Iowa, they passed their law a year ago. In Iowa, in the month of July last year, they had 104 methamphetamine labs in the state of Iowa. This year, after the law was passed, they had 4 versus 104 in July. It does make a difference. Will it stop methamphetamine abuse? I'm here to tell you, unfortunately, absolutely not. 20% is manufactured by local manufacturers. 80% comes across the border or is manufactured on the southwest border. Methamphetamine, to give you a little bit of a background on the, not background, but the drug itself is a central nervous system stimulant. It directly affects the pleasure center of our brain by releasing dopamine. And the best analogy that I think that I can make is that when any of us enjoy a sunrise or a wonderful meal or a similar activity, there's a release of dopamine in the brain. With methamphetamine, it's a dopamine dump. And the analogy that I like to use is that of at the Democratic National Convention or the Republican National Convention when they release all the balloons at the end of the convention and they pour down onto the floor. That's exactly what happens when you introduce methamphetamine to the brain. It is smoked, it's injected, it's eaten. They use the coffee filters that they use to strain it to make coffee. It affects each individual in a similar fashion. There will be some variances, but one thing it does, it suppresses the appetite. You no longer require sleep. I have seen people that have stayed up for as many as 12 days without sleep. Now, we all know in this room what a short night does to us. Makes you a little edgy, a little cranky, whatever the expression is, a little just on edge. Multiply that by 12. It produces paranoia. I've heard a doctor describe it. It is the best model. Methamphetamine abuse or methamphetamine overdose, as he described it, is the best model for paranoid schizophrenic. Most of the labs that we would go to, a lot of them would have holes in the ceiling, holes in the floor, that is shooting at law enforcement that they perceive are in the attic or in the basement or outside the house. It will have them do any given activity to the compulsive nature. One classic example, we did a search warrant. It was late at night. It was probably 1 o'clock in the morning. Neighbors came out and said, "What's going on?" We said, "We're serving a search warrant." And they said, "We thought something was going on over there, but we really weren't sure." And I said, "Well, what was your first clue?" And he said, "Last weekend when we came home, my wife and I went out for a night on the town, and we came home about midnight, 1 o'clock, and the husband was pushing the lawnmower as the wife was walking in front of it with flashlights, mowing the grass." Now, they will continue to mow that grass, not any long grass, but they'll just continue to mow that grass. They'll continue to clean their house. They'll continue to wax their car until they bring it down to the primer. They will clean to the degree of taking a toothbrush and scrubbing the floor. None of it is that it winds up in better condition than it was when you started, but it's that compulsive behavior to continue to do something like, I guess an analogy would be the ever-ready bunny battery. Just continue to go and go and go until they, during that binge cycle, they'll eventually crash and they'll sleep for 3, 4, 5 days at a time. Get back up, use methamphetamine again, and start the cycle all over. Meth, just like every other drug, the first time you use it, the first time that you had a glass of wine, the first time you had a beer, it took about a half of that beer or a half a glass of wine, and you felt a feeling that you thought, well, that feels pretty good. The next time, and as you go on, you never reach where you were on that first occasion. That is true with all of the drugs. They'll never reach that high that they achieved the first time through with methamphetamine and or any other drug.
I have a question in Lincoln.
Fire. Wherever you are.
In Lincoln, has anybody looked into the research possibilities of what other kind of chemicals would work like the hockey puck? Like in some psychotropic medications, they change around the chemical structure a little bit different, and they could even apply for a new patent on the medication. So is there any research showing that if they changed anything to a slight degree in the hockey puck substance, they could get the same kind of dopamine effect?
Yes, there is research, and as I explained, from the sodium metal, that hockey puck, that was one, and then when they thought, well, they're catching on to that, we'll go to lithium metal, which is a slight variance. They have gone from a 4 or 5 step process to now in the Omaha area, and I'm sure it's throughout the rest of the region as well, they've gone to a 1-pot method. That is, again, a little bit of a change, but it still manufactures methamphetamine. If the controls that are being placed in Oregon, as an example, just within the last 3 weeks, made Sudafed a prescription medication because they saw a decline, but they did not see a drastic decline in the manufacturing process. What most likely, as you're referring to there, the gentleman in Lincoln, most likely what will happen is there will be some kind of variance that somebody will come up with to manufacture yet another drug. Did I think that a paint or stain remover or chemical called GHB would be used as a date rape drug 10 years ago? Absolutely not. Did we know anything about ecstasy or MDMA 10, 15 years ago? Absolutely not. Did we think that people would take PAM or, which is the cooking grease, or aerosol cans and huff those until they got high? We did see that in history, with gasoline and the like. But will there be a change? Most likely. Will we ever take care of or stop the problem? Unfortunately, the answer is no. There has to be a demand for the reduction of use of illicit drugs in this country. What I always thought was convenient is we as a population were always able to blame it on, if the Colombians would quit growing the cocoa plant, we wouldn't have the problem. It was always someone else causing our pain, our self-induced pain in this country. And then it came to the point where we had to look at ourselves in the mirror and said, nobody's doing this to us with the exception of us. We're the consumer, now we're the manufacturer. And it changed the environment. Although, now that the desire or the market, so to speak, has been created for methamphetamine, along the southwest border, and Mexican groups that used to traffic in cocaine, that formed an unlikely alliance between the Mexican population and the Colombian population to move cocaine into this country, no longer had to deal with the Colombians. And they could manufacture the process and ship it to the United States themselves. So will we take care of it? Not until us, the U.S., the consumer, stops or limits their use of illicit drugs. There'll be a change.
I have a question
It's
from
coming
Hastings.
down the road. You know what it is? No. Is there another question?
I have a couple questions
ma'am.
from Hastings. Number one, are you going to
You gotta-
talk about, I don't know what y'all,
I'm listening.
Anything? Okay, you're on.
okay, I don't know what y'all call it up here, but coming from the south, we have Yarba, and I don't know if you're going to talk about that, and there's meth suppositories, and then also with the marijuana drug, if you see wet or illy up here with the embalming fluid and PCP.
Yes. To go in reverse order that you just spoke about, so that marijuana cigarettes are dipped in PCP to create a greater high, so to speak, or a hallucinogenic effect of both the drugs, and they're commonly referred to as sherms. They're just dipped in PCP and then smoked. Any way to introduce methamphetamine into the system or any other drug into the bloodstream is possible, whether it be through a suppository of some sort, whether it be any mucous membrane, any way to introduce it into the blood supply is something that has been done and tried, and to a 100% guaranteed effect once it gets in there, to a similar effect that if you smoked it, injected it, swallowed it, or inserted it into the body. And the last one that I don't know if I didn't hear you, but the first one that you spoke about and the last one that I was trying to address, I didn't get that name that you were talking about.
Yarba, I don't know what you call it up here. It's flavored meth, and a lot of times it's more like a lozenge.
Methamphetamine, if manufactured properly, will be a pure white substance. And as I said earlier, it converts 1-to-1 from pseudoephedrine or ephedrine to methamphetamine. Any variation in color is an error made by the cook. You'll see pink meth, which is some of the leftover coating from a particular brand of pseudoephedrine. You'll see yellow meth, which again is a residue from the coating, the candy tablet that's on top of the ingredient itself. You'll see brown meth, which is in overcooking in the process. That is, when you get your finished product, it'll still have some liquid on it. They usually put it in an electric fry pan, heat it up, and if they leave that on too long or heat it too high, it will turn brown. You'll see it in chunks. You'll see it in powder. And now what we're seeing an awful lot of is what is referred to as ice, which looks like, the best way that I can describe it is either rock salt appearance and or shards of glass from the old safety glass. When a safety glass is broken and it turns out into small little chunks of glass, that's what ice looks like. Ice is the base form of methamphetamine, and it is a smokable form of methamphetamine. Yes, ma'am, you had a question here? I'm told you have to push that button on the mic. Hey, I can speak on that. And in fact, if you want to show that first slide.
We can't, we didn't hear the question.
Okay, the question is when law enforcement enters a home Do they assume that it's a hazardous site? How do they protect themselves? Or how does the general public, maybe if they're entering that same atmosphere, protect themselves? And I asked for the first slide, which shows you how law enforcement dons an SCBA, a self-contained breathing apparatus, in what is referred to in slang as a moon suit. It is a plastic suit. We duct tape around the ankles and around the wrists, wearing rubber gloves, the SCBA, and protection over our eyes. The gases in the combination of chemicals, recognizing that most of the cooks are going from a recipe and do make mistakes. They're oftentimes manufacturing under the influence of methamphetamine, make mistakes. I'll give you one example. We went to a home. We discovered a lab in the basement of the home. What DEA's protocol was is that a chemist should be on site when you render the lab safe, collect your evidence, and destroy the hazardous chemicals. The lab was in the basement of the home, so we called the chemist. The chemist was on their way, and myself and about 5 others from my office started the search, based on that search warrant, the upper level of the home. We went through the entire upper level. I was in the kitchen. I went through the kitchen, through the cupboards underneath, and so forth, and there was a lady's purse sitting in the kitchen. I opened the purse, I looked inside the purse, and there was a large baby food jar in the purse. In the jar, I could see a substance. I opened the top of that jar, and in retrospect, I heard a ping as I opened the top of the jar, and it took my breath completely away. I was transported to the hospital, and I had burns down to my lungs, but not in my lungs, from breathing a combination of what is believed to be, by the cooks, a combination of hydrochloric and sulfuric acid that was in that jar. The pain of the examination and so forth, which involved a tube going up through the nose with a camera to look down into my lungs, that was done in the emergency room, was one thing that I don't care to experience again in my lifetime. But after a month, they said, please come back, and we're going to take a second look to see if the burns have healed. Now, the anticipation of the first time around was far worse than the first time around. So law enforcement takes precautions. Can you be say a visitor to the home, whether it be child welfare or whether it be some other capacity that you're visiting a home? Can you come upon a home that they're manufacturing meth? The answer is absolutely yes. If you smell, and I don't want to get down to any particular odor, but if you smell a strong odor, chemical odor inside the home, my recommendation would be to leave and notify law enforcement. Can there be, and somebody used to say, well, you know, the manufacturing process smells like cat urine. That maybe that's that anhydrous ammonia residue that's left over in the house. Now, somebody said there from Lincoln, I think you had a lady that had 170 some odd cats in her home. Now, that home smelled like cat urine, but there was no meth lab in that home. But any odor, strong chemical odor in the home, another telltale sign is any pink or a discoloration of a red pink on the walls or in the carpet is another good indicator. A lot of the cooks will transport their labs in a Tupperware container a little bit larger than this cardboard box I brought some of the ingredients into the room today. They'll move from a back road or a back street, a backyard, a basement, and an awful lot of them will go to a motel and manufacture in the hotel. One of the examples that I would like to use for what the residual effects of manufacturing is one particular search warrant. Well, we knew that there were 2 kids inside the home. We secured the search warrant. We knew the kids were there, so we waited until the bus picked them up in the morning as not to expose the children to the act of law enforcement coming into the home with guns drawn and so forth. The kids get on the bus, they go to the end of the street, make a right-hand turn, and we entered the home. Inside the home, this is what I found. In the garage was the smell of smoke and the evidence of a very recent fire. In the refrigerator, in the freezer compartment, in a mason jar, was sitting meth in solution, sitting in there on top of a box of popsicle sticks, or popsicles. In the bathtub was the blender, the hot plate, not the hot plate, but the electric skillet, some more mason jars, all sitting in the bottom of the bathtub and had been rinsed out. Now, what immediately came to my mind is my childhood. When I came home from school, after I got off of that bus at the end of that day, most likely what these 2 kids would have done, they would have gone in. My mom would always make me take off my school clothes and put on my play clothes. I got a snack. I went out to play. I came in and took a bath, did my homework, and went to bed. The fire was in the garage the preceding night when the kids were asleep in the home. If they came home from that bus ride to school that particular day, most likely they would have had one of those popsicles that were in the freezer. And at the end of their play or their homework, if that was something that they were allowed to do due to the paranoia and so forth of the parents, they would have probably been placed in that bathtub to be bathed before they went to bed at night. So I once said in the mid-90s when I was talking to a Chamber of Commerce is that I'm actually rooting for or hoping for the days of old when the drug was manufactured, law enforcement would buy it, identify it, take it, arrest, and put people in jail, rather than having the drug being manufactured, the chemicals being dumped out in the backyard, the chemicals being dumped down the drain to go into our system, that is the regular sewage system. Or as one guy said to me, do you remember the James River when they had that huge fish kill? He said there was a bunch of dead fish. He said, I dumped that, the remainder of our lab, into that, off of that bridge one night. And he said, I think I actually caused those fish to die. But that water just rolling down to the next lake or reservoir that it's collected in. Anybody have any questions? I don't want to keep you. I know that everybody has places to go and probably jobs to do, and I'm willing to stay however long you'd like, talk about anything that you'd like as it relates to drugs, that is, and share any experiences.
I have a question from Lincoln.
Yes, sir.
What's your experience in terms of how many people who develop mental health-like problems, how long those problems are sustained after they stop using the substance?
I just recently listened to a talk by a doctor that has, and I used in a talk not too long ago, and my wife told me you shouldn't say that because maybe some people don't watch TV like you do, but when I tried to answer along the lines of a medical question, I said, I'm not a doctor, but I did stay in a Holiday Inn Express last night. And she said, you know, some people may not get that, so you ought not use it. But you can see I didn't listen to her advice. The doctor said that there is some research right now that the damage that is caused, one of the things that happens to the brain is with the dump of dopamine the receptors stop working. As they say, we don't need all of these receptors at the bottom of the synapse, so when the dopamine comes, it can grab that little bit of dopamine that's coming here or that little bit of dopamine that's coming there. We don't need them all, so they will no longer function. The research says that they will not be regenerated. The damage that's caused to the brain, he said recently there was some research in a stroke victim or stroke victims where they forced the paralyzed side of the body to continue to work, literally forced it, and the brain found another avenue to send the message to move the arm after time. The body, the mind, or the brain itself was able to make another path, and so the hope or the thought process that any damage that is done can never be recovered, I think is probably a stretch. I think that the brain is capable, as the research shows, of making some other path on occasion and accomplishing the same task that it's at. One thing that we do see, because it constricts the blood vessels, we see an awful lot of stroke, regardless of age. They've seen stroke in vitro in children because the mother was using methamphetamine. The constriction of the blood vessels themselves caused that stroke. My first exposure to that was, again, shortly after this method was discovered. A lady, she probably was not any more than about 25 years of age, suffered a stroke. And for me, just in my lay experience, I had never seen that before. But as time went by and research shows that it does cause stroke. I want to roll through a few of these slides and just outline some of the things that some recent research has shown. And this was in reference to pseudoephedrine. It was released in April of 2005, a survey saying who thought that restricting the age was a good idea and so forth, who thought a logbook was required. This was something that I had put in here before the legislature here in the state of Nebraska passed what control we do have on pseudoephedrine currently in this state. I strongly suspect a year from now we will see a change in the local labs that are manufacturing methamphetamine. This is the Center for Disease Control. Out of the 1,791 events associated with the manufacturing process that they studied in 15 of the 16 states, 558 resulted in the injury of 947 people. 531 of them were law enforcement and 314 were the general public. 274 were treated in hospitals not admitted, 68 admitted, and 62 were treated at the scene, and 9 died. And there were 255 events of ordered evacuations involving 2,732 people. And as I talked a little bit about, 20 to 30% of the known methamphetamine laboratories are discovered by fire or explosion. This lady, Lorinda Mason, her boyfriend is Randy Schultz, was Randy Schultz. Randy Schultz is a gentleman that I spoke about a little bit earlier that claimed to have, on his birthday, discovered that lithium metal inside the lithium batteries would produce the same effect as the sodium metal. This picture I took off of her driver's license. Her driver's license had an issued date on it in July of the year. I arrested her the following January. 7 months later, and this is what she looked like the day I arrested her. She weighed about 68 pounds. She, as I described her in the past, she looked more like a Holocaust victim, not a survivor. There are examples of this everywhere throughout the nation. We have plenty of them from the state of Nebraska. Some of them you've seen in the local news. Some of them you've seen in the newspaper. Some of them are far more graphic than others. But the progression from normal, healthy, without methamphetamine is often very drastic. The change, the loss of appetite, the loss of sleep. One of the things that you see an awful lot of, which you see on this lady's face, are what are referred to as crank bugs. In a slang fashion, it's the feeling or that some kind of bug is up underneath the skin, and they will scratch the skin or dig at it until they can get what they perceive to be the bug out. Some physicians say that some of that is some of the chemicals trying to get out of the body that are not completely consumed in the manufacturing process. One lady I spoke to said that she had a bug on her eye, and it wound up to be the blood vein. One of the blood veins was showing in her eye, and she said she took her tweezers and kept trying to get it out, and she was successful at getting it out, but of course it was not a bug, it was the vein in the eye. Here's another graphic example. I think this may be a resident of one of the off-sites that was published in the paper over in Lincoln. Anybody have any other questions? Again, I'm willing to stay however long you'd like, talk about whatever you'd like, answer any questions you have.
I have a question in Lincoln.
Yes, sir.
Do you have a sense in Iowa
Okay.
and Nebraska whether it's more rural or big city, or whether it's more utilization is more related to race?
The demographics of methamphetamine is across every social, economic, stature, however one would say that in a better way than I just said it. One of the things that methamphetamine and the manufacturing of methamphetamine gave to the user is everybody, I say everybody, normal drug abuse, if you wanted to buy an ounce of cocaine, you have to know somebody that has the drug. You have to either have met them in prison, or a friend of theirs vouches for you as a crook rather than law enforcement. You had to have, as they call, the connection that you developed in prison or on the street to get the drug, because that drug made its way all the way to, say, Omaha, Nebraska or Lincoln, Nebraska. What methamphetamine did, and sometimes it was referred to as a poor man's drug, is it took all of that out of the equation. You no longer had to have or know somebody that had the drug. You had to have the ability to get to the store, walk, run, or drive to the store, and a recipe, and an hour of time to manufacture methamphetamine. That $100 versus $2,000 gave it, in the early days, the label as a poor man's drug. It is not. I just recently heard a story about a professional, worked in a six-figure income job, loved softball, played softball 3 times a week on different teams. One particular Thursday, he Somebody offered him some methamphetamine because he wasn't feeling on top of his game, so to speak. He used it. He used it the following Monday. He used it the following Thursday. And within a month's time, he was selling methamphetamine, got locked up, and is now facing federal charges. So the reason I tell both sides of that story is I don't think that there is any particular group that this drug can be identified with. Some ladies use it, and it's promoted as a weight loss drug. Some men use it as makes them more virile and attractive, endless energy. Some people in the trucking industry use it to stay awake for days on end. Take a look at the recent case in Nebraska where a college student and her boyfriend using drugs about halfway across the state could not find their way back to Omaha, Nebraska, and believed during the snowstorm that they were located in Omaha, Nebraska. When Dateline was doing a story on that, the guy interviewed me, and I told him, I said, you know, one thing that we've living through this whole problem since about 1992, I noticed one thing, and this is what my prediction is. I said a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago, we had 15 below zero and we had 18 inches of snowfall. I said it barely made the tagline on the Weather Channel. When that same storm hit D.C. and New York, it led off the nightly news every night. This storm, methamphetamine, has just now reached D.C. and New York, and that's why you're seeing it so prevalent in the news today. It is now a problem, and it is now a problem that we need to address.
What do you see in the state that they use to step on the drug or to cut it with?
An isotal is a favorite cut. It's a supplement. There is a veterinary supplement that they also use to cut methamphetamine called MSM. Law enforcement and people that sell MSM for legitimate purposes have joined forces. Somebody comes in and buys a 50-pound tub of MSM. Then oftentimes law enforcement's notified a shipment has come from the southwest border and or Mexico, and we can follow that back to the place where the drug is cut. Within, it's been about a year and a half ago, that same scenario played out here in Omaha, Nebraska, and the search led us to 74 pounds of methamphetamine between Omaha and Sioux City, Nebraska.
Do you see them use baby laxative or Pectin up here to cut meth with?
Yes, the answer is yes, and anything that has a similar composition that can double or triple or quadruple their weight. That is, if they wind up getting off of the southwest border, as an example, let me do it the easy way, because again, remember where I sat in that school row. I was the smartest in the dumb row. If they come off with 80% dope and they add the equivalent amount into that package, now you have 40%. And you add the equivalent amount, you got 20%, add the equivalent amount, you're down to 10. And an awful lot of the drug that comes from the southwest border, as it winds up in our area, winds up to be 10 to 20% pure. Keeping in mind that they paid the price at 80%, and every time that they add an equivalent amount, the price remains the same. at this end. So it's, again, another way of making a little bit extra money in the product that you purchase. Anybody here? Anyone else in some of the other sites have any questions?
I have a question.
If you have any questions,
hold it up.
yes.
From Norfolk, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I was wondering what you might have experienced for lingering biological and psychological effects from use of ecstasy.
Did I mention that I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night? No, I just saw the smile. It takes a while to get from here to Norfolk, I guess, over the speaker system here. One of the effects that ecstasy does, as well as methamphetamine, so that is a extreme rise in body temperature. They have recorded as high as 107 degrees body temperature in the use of methamphetamine and with ecstasy. There's grinding of the teeth in both drugs. And to address your question of ecstasy, oftentimes you'll see in what a very popular use of the drug ecstasy is in rave clubs. They'll sell pacifiers, and you'll see kids with either a pacifier hanging around their neck or in their mouth to prevent the teeth grinding, the uncontrollable teeth grinding. Oftentimes, my daughter, one of my daughters is a dentist. They refer to the decayed teeth as meth mouth, but they also see that all of the teeth in either ecstasy or methamphetamine are ground off to the perfectly level, flat, just from the gnarling and the grinding of the teeth. But those are a few effects. And I heard somebody the other day call them side effects, but I think I'd rather call them effects of the drug ecstasy and of methamphetamine.
What about taking Viagra with liquid ecstasy?
Combining the two. Well, one will dilate and the other constricts. I don't know if the blood vessels aren't just completely confused. I don't, to be, without being flippant, I really don't know, because I do know that the two, one is to dilate the blood vessels and the other is to constrict the blood vessels, but I don't know any of the other effects, and that'd probably be better posed to somebody as a pharmacist or a doctor that could differentiate that for you.
I have a question, Carney.
I noticed you were moving your hands after you asked the question, and I didn't know if you were saying, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about, or whether you had another question there.
No, I know what you're talking about. I know you stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night. My question is, what's the youngest age or ages of youth that you're seeing use meth?
We're seeing an increase in high school age students using methamphetamine. There was a recent study, and I wish I had it with me. In fact, I just, within the last week, spoke to somebody in the public school system, and they said over the last year they've seen and it was, a double-figure increase, whether it went, and I can't remember the figure, whether it went from 7% to 14% or 14 to 21%, but we are seeing an increase in the use in high school age students using methamphetamine.
I know you're talking about meth, but have you seen prescription sales of Klonopin and Seroquel hitting the streets?
You know, I'm going to have to stay at a Hilton tomorrow night if you're going to keep asking me. What is that, the two that you just named?
Klonopin and Seroquel are drugs that are going around Grand Island that people can get an intoxicated feeling out of, and it's actually kind of like heroin. It kind of gives you, it's a big downer.
Well, I am familiar with OxyContin and oxycodone, and that was often referred to as hillbilly heroin, and that is a prescription drug. It's a time-release medication manufactured for the purpose of treating cancer patients. What they do instead of taking the medication, and I think a very popular radio announcer was accused of that. I don't know that he's been to trial, but instead of taking OxyContin as it is prescribed, that is in the tablet form and in a time release over a 24-hour period, they're crushing it up and shooting it and receiving the effect that heroin provides to the abuser. You had a question right here in Omaha, Nebraska.
My question is, I know the state of Nebraska has put the cold pills and such behind the counter, but are there any kind of regulations for the retailers as far as how many they can sell, what they're supposed to do if someone asks for more than 2 or 3 or however many?
Yes, ma'am. To repeat that question is she's aware of the state law that was recently passed that put pseudoephedrine behind the counter. In this state, there is a limit of 2. That is 2 boxes of pseudoephedrine products to be sold. This state did not require a logbook. Iowa, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Oregon require a logbook with identification, but this state did not require that. There is a program in the state that was created by law enforcement and used by the retail merchants called Retail Watch, and that is educating the retailer on the products that are used, to include pseudoephedrine and the chemicals that are used. There was one particular convenience store that placed all of the ingredients to manufacture on one shelf all together, and then claimed that they had no knowledge of why people were buying copious amounts of pseudoephedrine and coffee filters and Drano and heat and so forth, but placed those all together on one shelf so that it was a one-stop shop, with the exception of anhydrous ammonia, to manufacture meth. In order for law enforcement to make a case, there was something just recently written that said, why would law enforcement pick on a retailer just trying to make a living? The requirement is knowledge as to what that is being used for, and that's usually accomplished by somebody walking in law enforcement, buying some of the products, start talking about meth, start talking about the process. How could I get some more? How can I get more? And the retail person participating in that conversation. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I have a question. I know that they're trying to set up new guidelines on the state and national level for treatment of methamphetamine addiction. Does your agency give any kind of input, or have they been asked for input?
Yes. There have been a couple of real recent studies, one out of the Hazelton Clinic up in Minnesota, which says, and I can't remember the exact month, but I think it's 18 months is the desired length of treatment. And you can find it by just Googling on the internet Hazelton methamphetamine study. And I just read it within the last couple of weeks. But they've done some extensive research. They have a program that they are have some science behind the treatment and the length of treatment. Most treatment thoughts today is anything less than 90 days is inadequate for the treatment of drug abuse. What has been seen is with methamphetamine, the time is longer than the 90-day minimum for drug abuse, whatever the drug may be. I think that treatment is an answer. I think demand reduction is an answer. I certainly don't, and even based on my background, believe that law enforcement is the answer. I think that the use or abuse, not the use, the abuse of drugs is a treatable illness, and we as a society would not write off a person with diabetes just because they're not going to take their medication or they're not going to stay on their diet or they're not going to get exercise, similarly to those that abuse drugs and can't stay in the program first time around. That's my personal opinion. I think that we as a society ought to take a much harder look at the treatment programs that are available. As I was telling somebody right here in this room, last night I spoke at a high school, and for the men in the audience, you'll understand what I mean, but a gentleman approached me in the restroom and started talking to me. Now, conversely, I'm not sure what the ladies do. They may talk in the restrooms, but men normally do not even make eye contact in the restroom. We go, we take care of business, we won't say hello, how are you, or anything. But a gentleman approached me, and the sad part of that story is it was during the break of a talk that I gave at a high school, and he said he has a 22-year-old daughter that just recently was arrested. She's been abusing methamphetamine for about 2 years, and she needs treatment. I don't have the funds to accomplish that. What should I do? I recommended that he approach the court and the prosecutor and ask for court-ordered treatment to see if he could get her in a treatment at the court's order rather than his own. And then I learned from a lady here in our Omaha audience that her company, business, agency is one of those agencies that helps people that do not have the wherewithal to get treatment when they want it. One of the greatest, I don't know if I want to call it heartbreaks in my career, is a person that was cooperating with law enforcement, was on the street, had not been arrested, got hooked on drugs, came to me and said, please get me in treatment. I've got a problem. I could not get her in treatment. I could arrest her and get her into treatment, but she had the will, she had the desire, she wanted treatment, and I couldn't get her in a facility. And that, to me, is not the way to go. Yes, ma'am. What we are seeing is they're buying, and it's readily available on the street.
I have another question. I don't know if you answered this or if this is common knowledge to you all, but like with the laws that changed as far as like crack distributors, people selling crack, is that the same for meth? Is that something that's happening now for meth delivery as it did when crack was a big epidemic and they start delivering harsher sentences?
Yeah. In my opinion, and I'll answer your question, in my opinion, I was working in D.C. during that time frame. Congress passed, under Title 21 of the United States Code, the penalties for crack cocaine. It was 5 grams, 5 years mandatory prison. 10 grams, 10 years mandatory prison. 5 grams is less than what you get at a restaurant in a sugar packet. Congress right now is revisiting that and visiting and trying to put methamphetamine and crack cocaine on the same schedule and the same punishment. So I'm not one to predict what the future will hold, but I suspect the crack cocaine time will be lessened and meth will, right now, 50 grams of methamphetamine gets you 5 years in the federal system, mandatory, without parole. Lincoln, anything else? Norfolk. Any more questions from anyone? And I know it takes a while to get to some of the outposts there, but if you have any other, I'd be happy to answer them for you. I appreciate you taking the time and listening to what I consider to be a very important topic. And thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you.
You did a great job. In fact, what I did, well, you did the right thing.
Thank you very much.
You bet.